So today it's our pleasure to welcome Dr. Laura Greiner. She's an assistant professor at Iowa State University, and she spent there 50% of her time teaching undergraduate students about swine production. Another 25% of her time is focused on conducting research, and the remaining 20% in extension programs. So Laura has currently 4 graduate students with her main research focused around gilt and sow development and reproduction associated with nutrition and disease. So before joining the Iowa State University about 1 year ago, if I am correct, she spent 13 years at Carthage Innovative Swine Solutions in the USA, where she served as Director of Research and also Nutrition Director. When she was at Carthage, she was taking care of a research program involving 6,000 sow research spaces, 4,800 win to finish spaces, and also a private biosafety level 2 facility, which at the same time she also working with various swine producers on their nutrition programs. So I can say that Laura has academic background. She's a scientist, but she knows a lot about practical application of the research. She's passionate about the nutrition of the reproductive female and also educating the next generation of animal scientists. So Laura, thank you very much for being with us today. It's a great pleasure to welcome you, and it's up to you.
Great. Thank you for the kind introduction. Well, good evening, good afternoon, good morning to those of you who are joining, depending on where you are around the world. It is a great pleasure to be with all of you today, and I look forward to sharing with you a little bit of information about how we feed today's sow from a practical standpoint. So some of the information today that we will cover will be really basic as far as how we feed the sow, how we think about her body condition, and we will also talk some about the amino acids, in particular in lactation. So challenge you a little bit on your nutrition programs to hopefully help guide you as you think about your sow care. So the title really focuses around what's happening with our sows today. Certainly, as we think about, even in the United States, our sows have changed dramatically in 30 years. We have gone from an average total born of 11 pigs to, in 2012, our sows on average had 13.4. Today, in 2020, our sows are fitting more into what is defined here as the elite sow, but is now average, where our total born is at 15 or higher in the United States. So we've seen a significant increase in the number of pigs that our sows are producing. And so naturally, as we think about her care, we have to be very mindful that we're asking her to do more today than what we did many years ago. And unfortunately, a lot of the research that we have, particularly when we think about our nutrient requirements, is from that sow for many years ago. So we want to be thinking about not only the number of pigs that she's producing in gestation, but we want to think about how much milk she is producing as a lactating sow. And so, of course, as the litter gets larger, her milk production requirements have also increased. There's nothing really that is changing about her milk. She's still producing similar levels of lactose and protein and fat in her milk, but it's just the volume of milk that we're asking her to produce each day has increased. So we define a hyperprolific sow as a sow that has farrowed more piglets than functional teats. And so today, In most situations, our sows have about 14 to 16 functional teats, and we clearly are seeing many litters being born where there are more than 16 piglets per sow. And so we want to look at those females maybe a little differently and recognize some of the challenges that we're asking her to do both in gestation and lactation. So we also want to define it a little differently from your herd maybe, is that if the sows have a higher total born than 75% of the remaining sow herd. So maybe 25% of your sow population is defined as your elite sow, your hyperprolific sow, and they need a little bit different attention than the rest of the herd. Again, management doesn't always allow us to treat those sows differently than the remaining of the herd. So how we adjust our herd nutrition and our herd management likely needs to focus on that top 25% of our sow population to ensure that everybody is getting optimal nutrition and optimal opportunity to produce large litters. So we'll first start in gestation with our sows. One of the key areas when we focus on gestation really comes down to body condition. We want our sows to be like that sow in the middle. We want her to be a normal body condition. We want her to fit in the ideal range. We don't want to feel the hips or see the hip bones, and we don't want to see the spine on that female. Tendency is that we like to have our sows a little bit heavier because we believe they're going to lose weight in lactation. Most of the time what we have seen today with the genetics that we are using in sow populations, the sows do really well with eating feed and lactation. And in fact, if we allow them to be a little heavier during gestation, they won't eat well in lactation. So we do want to try to keep that sow right in that ideal body weight range, not let her get too thin, but certainly not over-condition the female while she is in gestation. So why, again, is that important? If we over-condition that female, she is going to deposit fat into the mammary gland, and that will limit her milking ability. So when we think of that hyperprolific sow with many, many piglets, if we have fat in that gland and we cannot get the milk produced, then of course those piglets are going to suffer and the sow is not going to milk to her optimum potential. As I already mentioned, an overweight sow will not eat, and we'll talk about in a little bit how important the feed intake is for lactation. It is much more efficient for the female to eat feed to produce milk rather than trying to break down body tissue to produce that milk. So feed intake is going to be critical. And then lastly, one concern that we have will be shoulder sores in our females. If they are losing weight in lactation and then we're putting weight on in gestation and then they lose it again in lactation, we tend to see more issues with shoulder sores or pressure points on our animals. And obviously that can be a welfare concern. So we really want to try to maintain that weight and keep her consistent throughout. And then of course we can increase feed costs post-wean if that sow is constantly losing weight in lactation. So our management of a lactating female really starts in gestation, and it goes beyond just how much lysine is in the diet of that female. How you feed that gestating female can vary. Many systems like to feed a little higher level from weaning until breeding to flush the sow. That's very common. Typically it's about 3.6 kilos or more, and we offer that in 2 feedings. After she is bred, typically we want to keep that feed intake relatively low, about 1.8 kilograms per day. Part of this is because the sow will not really eat when she is in estrus, and so we don't want to waste feed. But we also want to not overfeed that sow and potentially cause embryo loss. After that first week, we can go ahead and feed that animal to improve body condition. So that can range from 2.2 to about 3 1.8 kilos. And then once we have confirmed pregnancy, we'll do a second evaluation of her body condition. If she is in her ideal body condition, we will set her on a maintenance ration, which generally is probably about 2 kilos of that gestation feed. But if she's still not in ideal condition, then we will continue to feed her at a higher level. 2 weeks prior to farrowing is generally when a lot of people want to increase feed. They would typically increase it by about 0.9 kilos. However, recent data would suggest and support that if that animal is already in good body condition a few weeks pre-farrow, we do not increase that feed. Increasing the feed pre-farrow for animals in good condition will not support any differences in fetal growth rate or birth weight. And so again, we do not need to do that. Plus it will cost us in feed. So we only want to increase the feed the last few weeks for sows that are still not in ideal condition. When the sow is introduced into the lactation rooms, we really want to focus on one of 2 options. We can either reduce feed intake to about 1.8 kilos a day, or we can allow the sow to eat ad libitum. She can eat as much feed as she can consume. Both modules work well. More recent data that shows feeding sows until farrow at full feed levels actually reduces pre-wean for the first 2 days of life. So there is some potential, while we don't change birth weight, it will potentially improve piglet survivability. And so some producers have opted to try the full feeding program pre-farrow. Others, due to concerns associated with stillborns and constipation, will continue to use the lower feeding program. Both programs have great options and they serve a purpose. And so again, learning your herd and understanding what's important in your herd will determine how you manage those sows as they become close to farrowing. So again, starting in around day 100, we certainly have a large amount of fetal growth, 5% of the energy that a sow consumes, and about 1/4 of her lysine that she's consuming is going to go to supporting fetus growth. In addition to that, almost 1 gram of lysine per day per piglet is required in late gestation to support mammary growth. So we do have a very large amino acid requirement for that sow at the end of gestation to support both fetal development and mammary growth. And we would much prefer to provide that in the feed than have that sow take that from her own muscle stores. So as I mentioned, if we are talking about lysine, if we improve lysine and we feed 28 grams of lysine a day, there has been some data to show that we can get a potential increase in birth weight, and that can result in US dollars at about 50 cents per pig marketed. So there are some potential opportunities there if you're not feeding or increasing lysine at the end of gestation that you may need to consider. While we don't necessarily need to fully increase the diet, there is still a lot of discussion around increasing the amino acid profile pre-farrow to support mammary growth and fetal development. So generally what we will see is that lysine intake will increase from mid-gestation to from about 10 grams of SID lysine to 15 to 19 grams of lysine. However, again, when we increase the feed intake in late gestation, we do not want to necessarily do it for animals that are in good condition. And if we do increase those feed intake levels, we should not anticipate an improvement in birth weights, except for in gilt litters, unless you are focusing solely on lysine. Okay, so here's some of that bump feeding data that I was just discussing. If we increase gestation feed in late gestation by 1 kilo, what we will actually see is a 7 kilo body weight increase for the sow. with a modest response on birth weight. So if we simply increase the volume of feed at the end of gestation, the sow is likely using the energy intake for her own body weight and not using the lysine as effectively. So again, that's why there's much discussion around just increasing amino acid requirement or amino acid levels in late gestation versus doing the whole diet increase. So once our sow is ready to go ahead and farrow her litter, we're going to start thinking about how we're going to set her up in lactation. Most of us understand that as the sow starts to nurse her litter, her milk yield is going to increase. It's going to peak at about 15 days of lactation. It will stay fairly high until about day 20 of lactation, and then it's slowly going to start to decline again in time. When we look at milk yield, we can actually estimate how much milk a sow is going to produce each day. So we can look at it as the milk required for maintaining the live weight of the pig, and then we can use the gain estimate for our litter to create a milk yield requirement. Why would this be important? Why would we take the time to do this? Well, it focuses in on how we estimate our amino acids, which we'll talk about shortly. We do know that with all of that, while we can estimate the intake and we can estimate the milk yield output, there are many other influences of milk production. Some of those would include our environmental factors such as heat stress and how we present the feed. Certainly genetics do play a role in milk production. What we have found is that our leaner body mass sows typically have a reduced feed intake, and so we have to find ways to alter the nutrient density to manage that reduction in feed intake. Parity, as we know, the young female will not produce as much milk as the older sow, and the same with feed intake. The young female generally does not consume the amount of feed as the older sow. And so creating a lactation program where you're meeting the needs of the young sow versus the old sow can sometimes be a challenge. Certainly feed intake is going to be key. As I mentioned earlier, a fat sow typically does not eat, and it results in a reduction in feed intake. And this feed intake will then result in a reduction in milk yield. So a sow that's consuming 6 kilograms of feed is only going to produce about 5 kilos of milk a day, where if we can get that feed intake up to more of an 8 to 10 kilogram per day intake, you can see how significantly higher her milk yield is going to be. And again, the reason why we keep talking about that gestation is that during lactation, if that sow loses a kilo of body weight, it's going to require 4 kilograms of feed intake in gestation to return that animal to proper condition. I've been involved in many studies where our sows will lose 10 kilos of body weight during lactation. And so that's 40 extra kilos of feed intake in gestation, which can become a significant cost to a production group versus working with that female to, of course, increase her feed intake in lactation. Not only does it help that animal and it reduces her non-productive days, but we get a larger pig at weaning because our milk yields are higher, and that results in significant economic return when you take those pigs to market. So how do we maximize intake? Many of us have focused on learning about feed intake programs. And those feed intake programs can be done in many different ways. So this is just one example. This example is allowing that sow to full feed pre-farrow compared to controlling her feed intake prior to farrowing. What you can see is that in the black line, if that sow is allowed to consume feed on her own pre-farrow, she will naturally decline in her feed intake prior to farrowing, and then she has the slow progression in feed intake post-farrow. Her feed intake is never quite equal to that sow that we controlled her feed intake program early. But if you look at that sow where we control her feed intake early and we let her eat feed as much as she wants the day after she farrows, she eats a very large amount of feed that first day. And then she will settle down and return to a very similar curve to what we see with the sow that was allowed to be on the full feeding program. When we actually look at the numbers and we look at total pounds of feed that a sow has consumed in the lactation pen, the numbers are very, very similar. But of course, if we look at the total pounds of lactation feed that the sow consumed from the time she farrowed until the time that she was weaned, the sow on the standard program is going to have consumed more. So again, we have to think around your management programs. We have to think about what your goals are and how you can effectively manage the female. Again, remember there are trade-offs. So if we do a full feeding program here, we may actually reduce pre-wean mortality slightly. But if we are more worried about sow weight loss due to high milk output and high litters, we might opt to do the standard program so that we encourage that higher feed intake during the lactation period. Other questions that we need to think about are how these sows respond when we do allow them to eat ad libitum in lactation. There are many different ways to start a sow on feed. Some people choose to full feed the day after the sow farrows. Some do a slow increase in feed like what you see here until about day 3, and then they allow the sow to eat as much as she wants. But when we do these programs, unless you're waiting until day 5 or day 7 to put the sow on full feed, what we have seen is these sows have a substantial increase in feed intake when we give them the opportunity to eat as much as they choose. And the variation that we have within a room can be quite large. So this is one room of sows. They were all allowed ad libitum feed. And we have a group of sows that eat a very high amount there in the black, and then the group in the red, and then the lower group in the purple, they just chose not to eat as much that day. But what you see the day after we do a full feeding event is we see this reduction in feed intake. We saw it in the last study, or the last slide, and we see it here as well. This is not uncommon. This is just associated with gut fill. There's obviously some hormone flux that's occurring because of all the food that's come into the sow. And so we do see, if we're going to allow sows to eat as much as they want, there will be a population of sows that really don't appear to eat much the day after they farrow. This again is quite normal. And if you look at those females after day 4, they all return to very similar feed intake patterns. And in fact, if we look at their wean to estrus intervals, there's really no difference in non-productive days. So while we have this shift and variation in a room, as long as the animals are returning to a normal feed intake level within 2 days after that spike in feed intake, they should be fine. But again, it's managing those sows when they're in that low point and observing them and making sure that the following day their feed intake has gone up will be critical. The other thing to keep in mind is that during lactation, we're having the development of the follicles for the next ovulation, for the next breeding. And that development is focused around hormones that need insulin. So we use insulin-like growth factor, and that's driving some of the hormones that are, of course, developing those eggs. And so we don't want to have a sudden drop in feed intake where that's going to influence that insulin-like growth factor, right? Because our feed is going to contain glucose. So the more glucose we have, the more insulin-like growth factor we have, the more FSH that we're going to be producing, which is going to grow those eggs and create a nice healthy environment. So if we're going to have this type of a drop in feed intake, we want to do it early in lactation. We really don't want to be doing a very slow feeding program and then full feeding the sow on day 6 or 7 and then having a drop at that point, because that's a really key area for follicular development for the next farrowing. So again, when you're doing your feeding programs, you really need to think about how you're going to manage around these types of feed drops to ensure that you're not potentially influencing your potential total born for your next farrowing. So with that, we're going to move on to some nutritional needs. I won't spend quite as much time on this information, but we will walk through it. And if you have questions, again, please remember to drop them in the chat box as we go through, and I'll try to take some time at the end to answer some questions for you. So as we think about all the needs of the animal, clearly nutrition is going to be important with the feed. We don't just want to throw any type of feed out to that animal. So we need to be thinking about how we create those diets. Too often in nutrition, we talk about percents in the feed. What percent of lysine do we have? What percent of crude protein do we have? But at the end of the day, we really need to think about grams. How many grams of that nutrient did that sow consume? How many grams of that nutrient did that gilt consume? Because when we start thinking about grams, it helps us recognize the difference between what the gilt might be consuming and what the sow might be consuming if we're feeding the same diet in the barn. So for example, if I have a common diet in lactation and the sow consumes 7 kilos a day and the gilt's consuming 6 kilos a day, and we are targeting 62 grams of lysine a day, our diet for our sow only needs to be 0.88% digestible lysine. But for the gilt, it needs to be 1.03%. So who are you going to feed to? Particularly when we think about the fact that the gilt is a very small percentage of animals in your farrowing house in most established herds. That's why some groups choose to top dress a little extra protein for their gilts. They'll just add a small diet that they'll just add to their gilt program. Other groups will choose to create a completely different program for their gilts so that they do get all the nutrients they need without potentially costing the producer a significant amount of money to feed that small population of females. So remember I showed you that equation where we determined milk yield. Milk yield starts to then help us understand how much amino acid the animal actually needs in her feed to help optimize her performance. So we can set that by looking at that milk output and then calculating crude protein from that milk. So we can estimate crude protein milk output by understanding our mean litter gain and the number of pigs that that sow is nursing. Once we have an estimated crude protein, we can dive deeper and we can look at the lysine and understand that milk itself contains about 7 grams of lysine per 100 grams of crude protein. And then we'll generally, as we formulate, set all the other amino acids relative to lysine. So when we start thinking about the amino acids, they're not just used obviously for the sow, and they're not just going straight from the milk, or sorry, from the blood to the milk. What we do see is that lactation increases amino acid uptake from the mammary gland, from the bloodstream. But what's actually more interesting is that more than 95% of what we define as the indispensable amino acid requirements are going to milk synthesis during lactation. So remember I showed you, or I told you the lysine requirement. We said 62 grams of lysine a day. More than 95% of that 62 grams is going into milk synthesis. It's not even being used by the sow in lactation. And so if we're not meeting that, our sows are going to consume high protein diets, but they're going to have a lot of muscle breakdown. So we know that if they're eating high protein diets, they'll have a lower muscle breakdown from about 2.8% relative to the 4.505% if we're not giving them enough protein. So protein and lysine are going to be critical in lactation for that reason. We also know that when we think about the mammary gland, in early lactation, we're going to see this peak with essential amino acids. It's going to be about 1.15 to 1.6 fold greater than individual amino acids alone. And the uptake and the output are almost equal in late lactation. So the mammary gland is going to take it in and it's going to push it right back out in late lactation. So again, everything that's coming in is pretty much going right out into that milk. If we look at, in particular, the milk amino acids relative to lysine, we can see here what those will look like. So in the milk, for example, if we say lysine is the value of 1, in milk we have a little bit more leucine than we do lysine, but then the rest of our amino acids are all lower in composition in the milk compared to lysine. But if we actually go over to the far right column and we look at how much the amino acid, or how much of each amino acid is being taken in by the mammary gland relative to lysine, not only is leucine being used or taken in by the mammary gland at a higher rate than lysine, but so is arginine. And what's interesting about that is that we do see that the mammary gland is utilizing certain amino acids, but it's not putting it out in milk. So what is the mammary gland doing with some of these amino acids? And I think that's really important because as we think as nutritionists, we always think about the typical lysine, methionine, threonine, tryptophan order. And that's really not what's happening when we look at the sow during lactation. So what's really rate limiting for milk production? Because of the fact that these sows are using some of the non-essential amino acids, could they potentially be more limiting than the essential amino acids? It's a little bit hard to define. So when we look at requirements and we start trying to estimate them, it becomes challenging because in early lactation, the sows are using the amino acids for things such as colostrum production and immunoglobulin production. In addition to that, after the sow has delivered her piglets, the uterus is going to regress. And so all of those amino acids are going to be in circulation. And so the sow can actually use the amino acids from the tissue of the uterus to help with milk production. And then also what's really key here is that some of our amino acids are being used for energy sources or precursors for other products and not necessarily composition of milk. And that's typically what we're thinking is happening when we start talking about arginine. Okay, so just briefly, when we look at lysine, I talk in terms of grams. I don't typically focus a lot on crude protein. I go back down into the amino acids to get a better understanding of how much these sows are using for different parts of their mammary development as well as milk production needs. So typically today what we're going to see is that a sow is going to need about 60 to 63 grams of lysine a day. This is going to vary a bit based on parity, but what we have seen is that as we increase those levels, the piglet growth rate increases. Because remember, for lysine, what goes in typically goes out. And piglet's first limiting amino acid is lysine, so of course that's going to drive litter growth rates. But we also see that particularly in a gilt, because she is still growing, she does respond as well reproductively to that higher level of lysine. We'll actually see her wean to estrus interval go down as we get closer to meeting her requirements of lysine each day as well. This, of course, is just a regression equation that we can use to start to estimate that lysine requirement. And this again goes back to the growth rate. So it's a different way of looking at it compared to doing a milk yield calculation, but it allows us to get back to the same answer. So this is that equation if you're interested in understanding how to estimate lysine requirements. We also know that beyond that, we do see that it's not just lysine, it's likely something in addition to lysine that's allowing us to get that piglet gain response. So this is sow feed intake there on your left. And as sow feed intake increases, obviously our lysine in the feed would increase and total crude protein per day is going to increase. We see that the wean to estrus comes down quite a bit. It's pretty responsive very early. And then it stayed relatively flat. But yet, as the wean to estrus no longer became responsive, sow weight loss actually switched to sow weight gain. And yet we continue, as we go farther into the feed intake, to pick up estimated litter gain there on your far right. So piglet average daily gain continues to increase. So when we think about that total response to lysine, it's a little bit different when we start looking at how feed intake might also be influencing it. So reproductively, while lysine is important, we can see here that other components of the feed are still driving things such as weight gain and litter growth. So that's why we start digging into our other amino acids. Threonine is certainly one that we want to look at. We're going to look at about 31.1 grams of digestible lysine if the sow is nursing piglets that are gaining about 230 grams a day. The more the piglets are gaining, of course, the higher that target will be. Most of our studies are going to support that. So depending on how you look at the information, you're going to be somewhere between that 36 and 40 grams, or you can look at it as a percent. Again, I much prefer to look at it as a ratio relative to lysine, because that's, again, how we've been trained. So about 57% should be the minimum requirement in your formulation program. If you would like, you can look here. So just to see that response, where we're picking the biggest response up here will be things like subsequent total born. As that ratio gets higher, you can see our total born has increased at about that 68 ratio. The same with our daily litter gain, it also maxed out at that point. So threonine is still very important, clearly, for milk yield and piglet growth. Total sulfur amino acids, such as methionine and cysteine, we really want to make sure that that ratio is around 50%. Most of the data that we see today is about the same, but again, there's very little data today on sulfur amino acids. Tryptophan, the sow follows very much the same tryptophan levels as what we would think about in a nursery pig particularly. So we want to target that ratio at about 19 for tryptophan to lysine. But keep in mind that the sow is going to require a minimum of 9 grams of lysine a day. Or, I'm sorry, of tryptophan a day. Most of the studies, we've had some relatively recent studies, and they're going to support that as well. Some show that you can go up to a ratio of about 25 for first parity females to reduce weight loss, or 22 is kind of optimized for the mature sow. Other studies are going to show a little bit lower level than that. So again, there is some opportunity for some variety, but it might be an option if you're dealing with some low intake animals to try to increase your tryptophan to lysine ratio. Valine and arginine and some of our branched chain amino acids, those are a little bit harder to come up with estimates because we really need to be looking at them as total branched chain amino acids rather than individuals. So there are values here, but again, we're trying to look at this more recently as branched chain amino acid levels. So valine, we're looking at about 38 grams of valine a day. Most of the data today has been a little bit variable. So the valine to lysine ratio has been ranging from about 76 to 122%. Other data has kind of been putting it more in the 73 to 86% range. So valine, again, that's why I think we have so much variation in this study, is that valine itself might be a limiting amino acid for milk production. If you remember that slide where we were talking about what's going into the mammary gland versus what was going out in the milk, our branched chain amino acids are going in at a higher rate than what they're going out in the milk. And so it appears that valine and some of our other branched chain amino acids are probably being utilized by the mammary gland as energy, and they themselves could become a limiting amino acid for milk production if we're not careful. But again, the way branched chain amino acids work, if the valine is low, but another branched chain amino acid is high in your diet, we may not get the response in the studies. And so that's probably why our branched chain amino acid studies are very difficult to determine their true requirements. Leucine, again, is one of those where we had a higher amount of leucine going into the mammary gland and not leaving. So we do believe that the average mammary extraction was the greatest for leucine at peak lactation. And lysine is really the highest at the prandial extraction. So we know that leucine is really needed in the mammary gland, but we don't really have good estimates for leucine at this point. So there's continuing to be some work here to try to better understand what's going on within the mammary system. Arginine is another one of those that fits into that category, and that work is continuing to be done. So we don't really have today a true requirement, if you will, for a sow beyond what the NRC has provided. We do believe this is probably going to change slightly as we start to better understand how the branched chain amino acids really work within the mammary gland itself. So the other question that we sometimes get when we look at all of the data that's out there for a sow and how we provide the nutrients in the feed is, why are there differences in results? So why does one study say this for valine and the other for valine? Well, part of this is because the sow mobilizes tissue in lactation. And if she mobilizes tissue in lactation, if she's overweight in gestation, she's not eating in lactation, and she's mobilizing tissue to support milk production, she actually has a different sequence of limiting amino acids compared to a sow that's not mobilizing tissue. So what Kim et al. Found in 2001 is that if a sow mobilizes tissue, she will have an order of limiting amino acids as lysine, threonine, and then valine. But if our sows are eating well, they're not losing weight in lactation, their limiting amino acids go lysine to valine and then down the order. So threonine and valine do switch back and forth depending on if the sow is losing weight or gaining weight. And that is something as nutritionists we need to continue to think about, particularly when we think about heat stress versus non-heat stress. And maybe those diets go beyond just increasing energy and increasing crude protein or increasing lysine alone, that we may need to think about shifting amino acid requirement ratios a little bit. Okay, so briefly here we'll talk on energy. So we know that a sow is producing more milk per kilogram of body weight compared to a lactating dairy cow. And just like the amino acids, 95% of the energy that we're consuming is going into milk production as well. And if she's not consuming that, she's going to take it off of her own body, which will of course cause the challenges that we just talked about with the amino acids. So where does she get her energy? She's going to get it either in the form of starches and sugar, which is ideal for milk production, but she can also, of course, get it from standard fat, diet, liquid fat, or dried fat in the diet. And we can certainly estimate those energy requirements as laid out in the NRC. But one thing that we may need to think about is the influence of fat source if we're going to add fat into a program. Rosero did some work in 2015 where he looked at different types of fat. And so an animal vegetable blend there at 6% versus a 6% of a straight animal fat, this choice white grease, found that we changed milk fat from the control, and the control is no added fat. So the control had 6.3 milk fat, but as we changed to animal vegetable blend, we changed milk fat up to 6.8% as expected because we're providing fat to the diet. But if we go from an animal vegetable blend to a choice white grease, we increase the milk fat even further up for the piglets. And so the type of fat may also be something you want to think about if you're trying to alter things such as litter weight. Certainly there are other things to consider such as organic minerals in the programs, making sure that we have good opportunity for minerals to support bone development, structure on our females, particularly our feet structures, and then of course to improve birth weights in those piglets. We also want to, of course, think about mycotoxin management. That is something that we continue to see an increase around the world year after year, is that our mycotoxin levels are increasing in our crops and our grains, not due to changes necessarily in storage, but for some reason, more likely due to, environmental changes that we're experiencing, and we're having some challenges there. So to make sure you're managing those mycotoxins, either with mitigation steps in the feed, or if you're allowed, or if you can try to find clean sources of grains. And then lastly, you want to always estimate that seasonal feed intake shifts. How are we going to change the diet beyond the fact that the sow is just eating less or that she's eating more? Lastly, in here, I'm not going to spend time due to the nature of our time frame here, and I want to leave some opportunity for some questions. But I did put a slide in here for managing heat stress. I know that Tonisity has a great webinar out already that focuses on heat stress, but just some things to think about if you're trying to increase feed intake. We can look at things such as adding betaine to the diet, or we can change the time of day or frequency of feeding. There are some great studies out there that show how we can potentially alter feed intake patterns simply through changing time of day or how often we're presenting the feed to an animal that's going through a heat stress event. If we want to try to focus on milk yield and milk output during heat stress events, we can add products such as fenugreek. Fenugreek is a natural herb that has been proven in women to improve milk production and has been looking very successful as well in animals. And then lastly, we can consider the nutrients. So David Rosero and his team also has some great work out that shows the difference between animal fat and vegetable fat and how that helps the animal through heat stress. So certain types of fat will be more beneficial than other types of fat when an animal is going through heat stress. So you definitely take some time, look through that information, and try to target some of the challenges that you have on a herd by using the tools that we have available in our database to go out and try to change it. So in conclusion, I do want to thank you for your time today. I recognize that we have to continue to work on a variety of things, not just genetics, but understanding how our genetics have changed and how they influence feed intake and those litter growth rates and body weight loss. We certainly still need to understand what's going on in the mammary gland, and particularly those amino acids, and what we can do there to potentially help improve milk yield or help that sow as she's going through that peak milk production in general. And then lastly, as you work with farms and as you work with your own systems, make sure that you understand the herd, the genetics, and identify the couple of key parameters that you want to focus on and start there, and then work work up to maximize to your best performance potential. I do again want to thank you for the invitation to speak today. And with that, I will close it for questions.
Thank you very much, Laura.
Yes.
I don't know if you can read the questions yourself, but I have seen 3 questions so far, so I might just ask them to you. So the first question is the relationship between the feed intake and the milk yield depends on body condition at farrowing. Is this correct?
Yes, that is correct. So we do believe that a sow that is over-conditioned as she goes into farrowing is going to have a lower feed intake. That data is out there, and it's very present that if she's overweight, she does not eat well. We also know, though, that feed intake is going to be determined as well by the genetics that you're working with. In my experience working with some of our pure lines, they're definitely more sensitive to feed intake compared to our synthetic lines and our commercial crossbred lines. And so understanding the genetics is also going to influence the feed intake and the milk yield potential.
Okay, thank you. So I just would like to remind everybody, if you want to ask a question, please use the chat function. So some questions are coming. One question was, do you have any suggestion on feed additives that you believe could improve the milk production?
Yes, that's a great question. So I did mention a couple of them there at the end that we've had some personal experience with that do seem to help. I think your bigger question is when are you trying to improve milk production? Is it milk production year-round, or is it milk production associated with a heat stress event or a hot time of year? There are many feed additive products on the market for gilts or first parity females just to help with improving feed intake. And again, while we really would like to get very specific and add certain amino acids or something that can help with milk yield, sometimes just improving feed intake in general will help. So there are products available. You may just have to do a little bit of searching, but many companies will have them. A lot of them are natural-based products that will have oils and such in them. Some groups will use a little bit of flavoring to try to entice our gilts to eat. We've tried things as well as using here in the United States porcine plasma, or now we use bovine plasma. After 2014, we've switched over to bovine. Thinking much like in the nursery, we can improve feed intake by using plasma in the nursery. We've tried that as well in gilts. So there are many items, and my list could go on, but hopefully what I put on the screen and what I just shared will give you a few ideas. And if you have more, you're always welcome to email me privately, and I can talk to you specifically about what you're trying to target and what might work well based on the data out there.
Okay, thank you. I have a question here about arginine. How much is it involved in the number of piglets in the next parity?
I think that's a great question. So we've conducted a couple of studies prior to me coming to the university where we looked at feeding arginine. And if we're feeding arginine in early gestation, there are a handful of studies out. Some would show an improvement in the total born, and some don't show an improvement in total born. If we look at the number of studies and the repeatability, it would suggest that feeding arginine in early gestation is likely not changing the number of pigs on that farrowing. Feeding it in late gestation isn't going to change the total born, but what we have seen is that in some studies, feeding it in late gestation will improve birth weights of the piglets. So there is some indication that arginine might be doing what we expect, which is being a vasodilator and getting more nutrients to the uterus by increasing blood flow. In the work that we've done where we fed arginine in lactation and followed those sows to the next farrowing, we were not able to pick up any significant responses by feeding different levels of arginine and lactation on the next number of total born. So I think we need to continue to look at it, but at this time we weren't able to find anything.
Okay, thank you. So you've been talking about amino acid requirements and the impact on the milk production or on the growth of the piglets, but someone wanted to know if you have information on the impact of amino acid nutrition to the sows on immunoglobulin productions and piglets immunity.
That's a great question. Yes, in some of the research that I was doing, certainly we know that if we're not feeding the animal a sufficient level, we are going to have a reduction in immunoglobulin level. So going back to the NRC in particular and making sure that we are meeting our crude protein and amino acid requirements in gestation is going to be critical. And then of course in early lactation as well. I've not seen any recent data that would suggest that certain amino acids are going to do a better job of improving immunoglobulin concentration. But again, that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I have seen some data where it would be suggestive that changing the amino acid levels of the feed might influence the type of products that are being produced in the milk. So casein versus whey, for example, it might make some influence there. So if we can alter those products, then one would assume we have the potential to alter the immunoglobulin, but I haven't seen a lot of data that would get me to the point today to say, yes, this is exactly what's happening.
Okay, thank you. Somebody was asking, what is your recommendation in the farrowing period? Would you recommend to give gestation feed or lactation feed?
Oh, I would recommend lactation feed. I'm assuming they're talking just immediately pre-farrow. So if she walks in to the farrowing house before she farrows, do we feed her gestation feed or do we feed her lactation feed? I am of the belief that we need to be feeding her lactation feed. Part of that, it goes back to just trying to set her up from a colostrum perspective, making sure that we're not limiting her and really giving that mammary gland kind of a boost, if you will, because that lactation diet is going to have more amino acids in it. It's definitely a higher density diet in terms of amino acids. And so that boost, even though we're giving her probably things she doesn't need, we will be giving her more arginine, we will be giving her more lysine, and we'll be giving her more of the things that that mammary gland needs to have the energy to produce what it needs to produce. And so I'm very much in favor of using the lactation feed.
Okay, thank you. A few more questions. So one question is, how important is it the activity or the intensity and the vigor of the piglets on the milk yield?
Yes, so that's a great question. So pig vigor is going to have a very large drive on milk yield. It's a little hard to measure, to be honest, because we look at it as the only way to measure milk yield typically, unless we're going to milk a sow, is to do weighs, right? We'll weigh the piglet, we'll let it nurse, and then we'll weigh it again and we'll estimate milk yield. But certainly we know there is that biofeedback mechanism where if the sow isn't being nursed, then prolactin levels are going to go down and milk yield is going to go down. And so it's kind of a reverse function. If feed intake is going up, the sow is trying to produce milk, but if the prolactin isn't there, then the milk yield isn't going to be increased. So it's almost like physics, right? It's a potential versus reality. And so if she's consuming a large amount of feed, but the mechanism to produce milk is quieter, she's going to likely put that on as weight. So she's going to gain weight in lactation, and her piglets, they'll grow, they just won't grow to the potential that they could if they were more vigorous at the underline.
Okay, two more questions. One is about the fiber. What do you think about the SDF and IDF content in the lactation diet? So do you think the fermentable fiber and non-fermentable fiber can play a role in modulating the lactation performance?
Yes, that's a great question. There is some really good research out on that. Pedro Urella up at University of Minnesota has been doing a lot of work on fermentable fiber and non-fermentable fiber, and he has a review. He has it in a book, and then I think he's got it out actually as published information. I would encourage you to take a look at that because he breaks it out and defines fermentable fiber versus non-fermentable fiber, and he breaks it out by the type of ingredient, because while some of them might all have similar fermentable fibers, there's other components to the fiber that we need to consider. So two ingredients that look very similar in fermentable fiber may still have a different behavior in the sow compared to others. And so there's definitely a large amount of material out there, and I think that in itself would be a 1-hour discussion. So I'm sorry for the vagueness in my response, but definitely the types of fiber that we have are going to be very influential, but we have to think beyond just fermentable and non-fermentable. We have to think about what other components are in that fiber as well.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about the recommendation that are done at the moment in Europe, especially nutritionists from Denmark, who are recommending to increase the feeding curve from day 90 of gestation till the end of the gestation. And this is not only for sows of bad condition, but also sows of good condition. They recommend to increase the curve to 3.8 to 4 kilo per day. So from day 90 till the end of the gestation. Do you have any opinion on this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I visited with a few individuals back in February on this as well from Denmark, and their definition of a hyperprolific sow is definitely different than what we're dealing with in the United States. Our sows are not producing the number of pigs that some of the European strains are today. With the information that we have here in the United States, we are not picking up the advantage, but I understand that some of the challenges that we have in the extremely hyperprolific females in Europe is the small pigs that are being born and the variation in birth weight. And so it's very possible that there is still some value with what they're doing. And I apologize, I haven't had a chance to really review their diets to better understand what increasing the feed might be doing beyond just increasing some lysine. But I understand that the goal is, of course, to try to improve those small pigs, and it's very possible that it's offering some value there. I'm sorry if it doesn't sound like I have a very clear opinion, but I recognize that there are differences between United States production and European production, and it might fit over there specifically for the genetics that they're trying to serve. But without seeing the data, I don't really feel comfortable commenting.
Okay, thank you. One additional question about the salt. So you reducing the salt in the diet, can it have an implication in case of MMS syndrome?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that's an interesting discussion. We are actually just starting some work on MMA syndrome. We're seeing an increase in that in the United States currently, and for the most part, no one has changed salt, and yet we're seeing a significant increase in MMA in the United States. And so I think that's a great question to ask. In the past, I've always been very much in favor of a constant level of salt in the diet and not really thought about it in terms of MMA. I still don't believe that salt is a significant role player with MMA. I believe that it's associated more with potential bacterial toxins that we haven't identified yet, or more likely something that's in the feed that we haven't identified. Certainly when we think about mycotoxins, we know they can be influential with MMA, and for the most part, we don't test all of the mycotoxins out there. And so it's very possible that we're missing one. Because again, if we look at trends and patterns, we're seeing an increase in prolapses across the industry. We're seeing an increase in MMA, and yet we're not really changing the diet significantly. So it's likely some component that we haven't identified yet.
Okay, thank you. I always tell you this is the last question, but every time there's one more question coming, so I don't know for how long this is going to last. Yeah. Do you think it is possible to reduce the IUGR piglets, adding functional amino acids to the gestation diet? And if yes, which amino acids could be used?
That's a great question too. IUGR piglets are definitely a challenge, and we have to go back to thinking about why they're IUGR pigs. You know, initially, to be honest, some of my thoughts were to go towards an arginine to try to improve vasodilation, thinking if we can get more blood flow to the uterus, that these piglets could get more nutrients than what they typically would in the uterus. We're not necessarily seeing that when we look at that. Obviously, we've changed a little bit on the birth weights, but we're not seeing this reduction in IUGR piglets. I think there are some other challenges associated with the IUGR pigs that we don't fully understand. And there's some great work that's being done in England right now on that. And until we better understand the physiological issues associated with the piglets, I don't think we can start looking at functional amino acids. And so hopefully they'll be able to get some of that work to better understand what's going on in the uterine environment, what type of uterine secretions and so forth that could be influencing that IUGR piglet. And then I think we can go ahead and start digging into functional amino acids.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I would like to conclude with a question about your opinion on what kind of research or which area of research do you believe we need to focus on in the next 5 years for Sows?
That's a great question. I think a lot of the questions that we just had in the chat are very legitimate questions and concerns that we need to continue to investigate. From my perspective, we're focusing a lot right now on sow longevity, but we are working on some studies in lactation. And I think one of the key areas is understanding that branched chain amino acid and how that might be influencing our milk production potential in our sow. But certainly this IUGR situation and low birth weight pigs continues to be an area that we have to address in the next 5 years. That is not one that we can push to the side and ignore. We have to come up with some answers and some solutions. So those two key areas. And then lastly, to continue with the sow longevity is to work not just on lameness, but to work with these other conditions such as prolapses and agalactia that we're starting to see as trends in the industry. Once we've identified trends, it's best to start working on those to try to minimize the impact that they could have if left unchecked. So that's kind of what we're looking at today. We've got projects going on with agalactia and prolapses, and then We're working on lameness currently. We have a few studies completed on that, and then we will be chasing some more on mammary development shortly. So those are the 4 key areas that I think that we need to look at in the next 5 years.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody was asking, this is not to you, this is to me. Somebody was asking me how many people were attending this webinar. So we had 90 plus people wanted to join, and we had close to 40 who made it. So maybe we have some technical issues. I have received some emails of people who were not able to join. So this is something we have to look at for the next webinar, which will be on the 13th of November with Dr. John Patience, also from Iowa State University. And he will be talking about the water in pigs, water quality, needs, requirements, consumption, and so on, all aspects related to water. So this could be of interest to you. We will advertise this webinar in the coming days. So Laura, thanks again for your time and for sharing your knowledge, and thanks to everyone for attending this webinar.